Coming up next, Edward Griffin speaks with Book TV at FreedomFest, the annual libertarian conference held in Las Vegas. Mr. Griffin talks about his book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, which is a history of the creation of the Federal Reserve System. This is just over 15 minutes.
The book on your screen was first written in 1994, but it is currently in its 32nd printing. This is the 5th edition, and the author is G. Edward Griffin, and he's joining us here on Book TV on C-SPAN 2 in Las Vegas. Mr. Griffin, who is the creature from Jekyll Island? Or what is the creature?
What is the creature, yeah. I had fun with that title because I thought if anybody saw it in the bookstore, they might think it was a sequel to the, Jurassic Park or something like that. The creature from Jekyll Island is the Federal Reserve System. And the reason for the Jekyll Island connection is because one of the most interesting things about the Federal Reserve is that it was created on Jekyll Island. It's a real island. It's off the coast of Georgia. And it was on that island back in 1910 that a small group of men gathered, and it was their mission to draft what became eventually the Federal Reserve Act. And I see you're going to show the pictures there. Yeah, those are the guys. And the funny thing about that piece of history is that the Federal Reserve Bill was being sold to the American people at that time as a piece of legislation that was going to somehow control those big bad bankers. And what they didn't realize is that the big bad bankers that you're looking at right there, those are the epitome of the great power centers of banking. They were the ones that were busy writing the bill that was supposed to control themselves.
Who are these 6 gentlemen, Mr. Griffin?
Well, they're representatives.
If you could walk us through them.
Primarily, Senator Aldrich is the only one that wasn't a banker. He was the politician. He was the one that was sort of spearheading the political side of it.
But father-in-law also to John Rockefeller.
John Rockefeller, yeah. He was tied in very closely to the banking fraternity and the industrial complex. A very wealthy guy in his own right. He's probably the most important political figure in the United States, short of the president, who was Woodrow Wilson in those days. But the rest of these guys are all bankers, and they represented the dynasties of J.P. Morgan and William and the Rockefeller dynasty, and they had connections to Kuhn Loeb and Company that were there, and that means they were connected to the Rothschilds in England and France, and Max Warburg was there. Paul Warburg was there, and he had connection to his brother Max, who was the head of the banking, the Warburg Banking Consortium in Germany and the Netherlands. And so what we have is this was an international group here, really, representing international finance. And if there was anything that was the epitome of the big bad bankers of the world, these were the guys. So what happened there is that they knew that there was going to be some kind of a move to control banking. They knew that Congress was going to pass some kind of a law to regulate banking. And so instead of being stupid about it and just sitting back and saying, I hope they don't do too bad, they decided to take the lead. They said, we'll write the bill. We'll make sure that it's to our liking. And so that's what it's all about. They went to Jekyll Island where nobody knew they were going, where they had a meeting that was in a great deal of secrecy. They denied that they went for many years thereafter, But they actually drafted the Federal Reserve Act on Jekyll Island in 1910, and then the next 3 years it took that much time to promote it and get it through Congress.
So 1910, William Howard Taft was president, and the 6 gentlemen who were there, Nelson Aldrich, Republican whip in the Senate, Henry Davison, senior partner of J.P. Morgan, A. Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Frank Vanderlip, President of National City Bank of New York, Benjamin Strong of J.P. Morgan, and Paul Warburg, partner representing the Rothschilds and Warburgs in Europe. And you say that in here that they represented essentially 1/4 of the entire wealth of the world.
Of the entire world. An incredible statement. That's not my appraisal, but that was the opinion of the journalists at the time who were writing about these people, not in connection with the Federal Reserve, but they were prominent bankers, and they talked about the Jekyll Island group, for example, and then these bankers in particular, and the investment houses of Kuhn Loeb and Company and so forth. But they said these men represented directly through the power that they held in their own hands, and indirectly through the money that was concentrated in the investment firms like the insurance companies and the banking companies. Put it all together, they said it was 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. And that concentration of wealth has only increased since then.
Mr. Griffin, was the Federal Reserve Act at the time it was being debated in Congress, was it a controversial thing? Were newspapers full of articles about it?
Yes, it was. It did receive a lot of publicity at the time, and there was a lot of discussion that somehow some people were aware that the banks had an influence in this legislation. And when Senator Aldrich first released the legislation, it was called the Aldrich Bill, and that was really bad. Warburg said, Nelson, he said, don't do that. He said, people know that you're a Republican and that you're rich and that you're connected with all of the investment houses. Don't call it the Aldrich Bill. And Aldrich apparently had a great deal of ego, and he probably said, well, after all, I'm well respected and so forth. So he did call it the Aldrich Bill. Well, then that's when the controversy started. People said, well, exactly what Warburg said they were going to say. So that's when they pulled the bill back, because it had a lot of bad negativity about it. And then they reissued it, almost the same bill, but they got some Democrats, Carter Glass. It was called the Glass Bill. But he was a Democrat, so that was okay, you see. People still, even in those days, had the idea that somehow Democrats were hardworking people, blue collar and dirt under their fingernails, like Ted Kennedy. But so it worked. The point is the ploy worked, and okay, now it was a bill being sponsored by the common man, and that's how they basically.
So in your view, the bill, the Federal Reserve from the beginning was a ploy?
Oh, absolutely, it was a ploy. It was a brilliant piece of strategy. These people were not stupid. They're great psychopoliticians, they're great strategists. And in fact, while the bill was being debated in Congress, some of these people went before the public. They gave speeches knowing it would be reported in the press, and they were interviewed by journalists, and they said, oh, this bill that they had written on the side, nobody knew it, but they said, this bill is not going to be good for business. It's bad for America. And they actually did that ploy. And knowing full well that the average guy would read that in the newspaper and say, these big bankers don't like the bill. Must be pretty good, These fellows were brilliant, and that's how they sold it.
Well, you asked the question in your book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, what is the Federal Reserve, and what is your answer?
Well, what it is, it's a cartel. It's not a government agency. It has the appearance of it being a government agency, and they went to great lengths to give it that facade. It does have the power of government because Congress voted to give the power of enforcement to it. But in its essence, underneath it, it's a cartel. It's nothing different than a banana cartel or an oil cartel or sugar cartel. It happens to be a banking cartel. They got together, they drew up the rules and regulations for their own industry, to self-regulate their own industry is what cartels do, and then they sent it to Congress, and they took off the label at the top that said banking cartel, and they erased that, and they said Federal Reserve Act. Congress passed it into law, and that's why we think it's a government agency, is because if you don't obey the rules that they set down for their own industry, you go to prison. And so it looks like a government agency. But basically the answer to your question is it's a banking cartel.
When did you get interested in this topic?
Oh, golly. I first became interested in this topic in the middle 1960s. I was producing some rather low-budget documentaries, and I thought, a good documentary would be on inflation. What's the cause of inflation? I wasn't too sure myself what it was, but I knew it had something to do with the manipulation of the money supply. So I started to do some research, and I never did produce the documentary, but that's when I got my interest into it. I had a box full of research, and then anyway, eventually I got the box back out and started to give some talks on it, and it just sort of grew. There was no great milestone along the way. That the more I learned about it, the more I realized that it was a very important topic to the future of our country.
You write in The Creature from Jekyll Island that the FDIC is not insurance. What is it?
Well, this is a hard thing to answer because you have the problem that when you over-insure something, or if you insure something to the point where there's no risk at all, then there's a tendency for the thing you're insuring against to happen. You know, the old jokes about it. You've got the store that's losing money, and so you insure it for $1 million, and by golly, it burned down. You know, just couldn't help it. It just, somebody left a match, I guess. Yeah, that's called moral hazard. And when, that's the name the insurance industry gives it. So when you have a government agency guaranteeing that banks cannot fail, and they're going to take taxpayer money, okay, and make the banks whole again, if they go belly up or if there's a run on the bank or something like that, you are encouraging banks to make risky investments and to make risky loans, because what have they got to lose? They know that they're not going to be allowed to suffer the consequences of their own acts. And secondly, the FDIC isn't really insurance. It doesn't really rate the banks. In other words, the more risky banks don't pay a higher premium than the more conservative banks. They all pay the same rate. So this is another form of moral hazard. Those who are conservative and are doing the best for their stockholders and their investors are making less money, and the reckless banks are out there making reckless loans and everything and making more money. And so the conservative banks say, well, I guess we better be reckless too. And so the whole industry tends to go that way. And that, by the way, is a shorthand way of explaining what's happened to our banking industry in the last, next year the Federal Reserve will be 100 years old. So this has been going on for 100 years.
So, Mr. Griffin, what should be done in your view with the Fed?
There's only one thing to be done with the Fed. If you remember what it really is, it's a cartel. A cartel that has the monopoly power of our nation's money. The Fed needs to be abolished. There's no other way around it. You cannot take the power to create money out of nothing and give it to men and expect that power not to corrupt those men. I don't care whether they're bankers or politicians. You give that power to anybody, eventually they will be corrupted by it. The Federal Reserve System is a cartel, and I think America needs to abolish it before it abolishes America.
Is that politically possible?
It's not politically possible now because the average person doesn't understand it, and so they wouldn't support a move. But it's becoming more possible with the passage of every month, and certainly every year, as more and more people are waking up to the fact that our banking industry is based upon fraud, and that these bailouts and all these stimulus programs that are being done with this newly created money, this is not helping the people, it's plundering the people. As more and more people come to that awareness, then it becomes more and more politically possible. Right now, I don't think it is, but when I wrote this book some years ago, there was practically zero interest in the topic. And now we've got demonstrations and end the Fed movements and investigating the Fed, audit the Fed movements, and the movement to abolish the Fed is actually growing. I see that on college campuses. Once in a while, I have an occasion to speak before a university group, and you'll see people with placards, end the Fed, end the Fed. Well, this is the new generation coming up, you see. So, again, back to your question, it's not possible now, but the movement is growing, and I think probably in the next probably 8 to 10 years, it probably will happen.
Would you advocate something replacing it?
I don't think anything needs to replace it except honest banking. Remember, it's a cartel. I don't think that bananas have to have a cartel to be sold. Individual banana companies can sell their bananas without joining a cartel and regulating the prices. So I would say, let's return to honest banking, and that's what would replace it.
We've been talking with G. Edward Griffin, the creature from Jekyll Island, in its 32nd printing. He's also the founder and president of Freedom Force International and the creator of the Reality Zone. What are those?
Well, Freedom Force International is it's a group, it's an organization, and as the word suggests, it is international. It's a group of people that want to bring about positive change, and they have a plan to do it. They're not just a bunch of complainers. They have a plan to do it. And that plan is to kind of reverse the process by which we feel we've lost our liberties and our control over our system. There are people who really have a lot to gain from the present political and banking system. They have a lot to gain, and they have gained a lot already. They're very wealthy, they have a lot of political power, and they have acquired that power by gradually moving into what they call the power centers of society. And they take them over at the top. They know that people follow groups. They move in groups. And so they figure if they can just get control of the leadership of important groups like political parties, for example, or labor unions, or media outlets, then only a few people can lead the many. That's how we've lost our control of the system, because these power centers have been in the hands of people who want the system to look exactly like what it does look like today. So our plan is to reverse that process. We are bringing people together into a network and helping each other to move back into those power centers and reclaim authority and influence in those power centers. That's Freedom Force International.
And what's Reality Zone?
And Reality Zone is our commercial site where we sell things. We sell books and recordings and video documentaries, and we sort of explain why it is we're doing this and what we hope to achieve.
And realityzone.com is the website. 32 printings, 5 editions of The Creature of Jekyll Island. How many of these books have you sold?
I think it's approaching about 500,000 now. Very close to it.
G. Edward Griffin has been our guest on Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
Well, coming